Elvis Presley wasn't just a voice that changed music. He was a living myth. For decades, his name was synonymous with style, swagger, and Southern charm. But beneath the jumpsuits and the lightning-fast hips was a question no one could answer. Who was Elvis, really? People guessed, stories multiplied. But in 2025, the guessing game finally ended. A groundbreaking DNA revelation shattered long-standing assumptions about the king's true identity. What science uncovered didn't just challenge a few family legends, it pulled back the curtain on an American icon and forced the world to see Elvis in a way they never had before. Even in death, Elvis remained wrapped in mystery. His legacy outlived him by generations, but the man himself remained strangely elusive. He wasn't just a musician. He was a symbol of America, a Southern hero born in poverty and turned into a myth. But as the years passed, whispers grew louder. His looks, his mannerisms, his musical instincts, they didn't always match the story the world was sold. The contradictions in his life sparked endless theories, many more complicated than tabloids dared print. Because behind the rock and roll legend was someone far more layered, and people could feel it. In the decades after his passing in 1977, questions about Elvis's origins only intensified. Fans began tracing family lines. Scholars compared archival photos, mapped migration paths, and cross-checked baptism records. Was his story the full story? Something felt missing. Even in the 1980s, amateur historians and devoted fans dove into genealogical records, uncovering strange inconsistencies and long-forgotten names. Some said the truth had been erased. Others believed it had simply been hidden, waiting for the right tools to bring it into the light. And in the age of DNA, those tools finally arrived. For scientists and genealogists, Elvis wasn't just a celebrity. He was a cultural riddle waiting to be solved. New technologies promised clarity, but the process wasn't easy. Access to Presley's direct DNA was scarce, and legal roadblocks were everywhere. But that didn't stop dedicated researchers. Relatives came forward, archives were unlocked, and one driving question connected it all. Who was Elvis Presley before the fame? Who was he when the cameras were off and the rhinestones were packed away? What made the mystery so haunting wasn't just its celebrity allure. It was what it said about American history itself. This wasn't just about one man. It was about race, class, heritage, and the stories we choose to tell about greatness. And by 2025, the story was ready to change. A new generation of scientists cracked the genetic code. They pulled threads from the Presley lineage that had never been fully explored. What they found pulled Elvis's past and America's with it. But to understand what changed, we need to understand where it all started. Before Elvis was a king, he was a child of the American South. The Presley family name traces back to a German immigrant named Johannes Rieler, born in 1669, who fled war and instability with his wife in 1710. Like many others escaping hardship, they sailed to the British colonies and arrived in New York. To fit in, Rieler became Pressler, a name that would eventually evolve into Presley as the family drifted further south. By the 1800s, they had settled in the rural South, first in the Carolinas, then deeper into Tennessee and Mississippi. These weren't wealthy elites. They were farmers, laborers, the forgotten white working class. When Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, was born in 1916, the family lived in a tiny shotgun house in East Tupelo. They didn't have money. They had hope, hard work, and the support of a church-centered community. That upbringing carved the foundation of who Elvis would become. This version of Elvis's story, the poor Southern boy made famous, fit neatly into post-war America's dreams. It was marketable, it was clean, and it placed Elvis right where the public wanted him. A white man with roots they could understand. Johannes Rieler's immigration journey became a historical footnote, easily embraced and never questioned. But while his paternal roots were mapped and well documented, the maternal side of Elvis's family was something else entirely. That's where the fog set in. That's where the stories began to twist. It all centers around a name that never stopped surfacing: Mourning Dove White. According to family legends, she was a full-blooded Cherokee woman, the great-great-great-grandmother on Elvis's mother's side. Mourning Dove White wasn't just a footnote in the Presley family tree. She was the spark that ignited generations of speculation. Oral traditions, faded records, and fan-driven genealogies all pointed back to her. Some said she married a white settler named William Mannell in the early 1800s, somewhere in Tennessee or Alabama. That union, if true, would mean Elvis carried Native American heritage through his maternal bloodline. Elvis's mother, Gladys Presley, was said to believe it wholeheartedly. She repeated the story often, and in the South, claims of Cherokee ancestry were not unusual. In fact, they were often seen as a badge of honor, a whisper of connection to something deeper, older, uniquely American. But when it came to Mourning Dove, the details were hazy. The name itself felt symbolic. Mourning was a common first name in the South at the time, and White was also a familiar surname. Was she real, or was she legend? And yet, something about the story endured. Something about that name stuck with fans and researchers alike, because it hinted at a truth that had never been confirmed, a possibility that shook the foundation of what people thought they knew. What if the man they called the king wasn't just a symbol of the South, but a mirror of its most buried contradictions? What if behind the suits and the stardom was a story about America itself? Messy, mixed, and more real than we ever imagined? What if the story everyone believed was never the truth to begin with? What if a name passed down through generations wasn't history at all, but a mirage stitched together from memory, fragments, and longing? That's exactly what researchers began to suspect about the elusive Mourning Dove White. Her name sounded poetic, even mythical, but when genealogists traced the trail, it led to blurred footprints and vanishing ink. Some began to believe she might never have existed as described. One theory uncovered a woman named Mourning, the mother of William Mannell, and a neighboring family with the surname White. Could it be that two separate names were accidentally fused into one legend? There were no tribal affiliations to anchor her to any recognized Cherokee lineage. No census listing, no birth records, not a single formal link to a federally enrolled Cherokee group. And yet, her story endured, passed down like a cherished song, not because it was proven, but because it meant something. In the American South, identity was more than paperwork. It was memory, myth, and survival. And in the early 1900s, claiming Cherokee roots had its own quiet power. It offered pride, even status, while also helping families distance themselves from less socially acceptable backgrounds. The image of Mourning Dove White didn't just persist, it expanded. She was in books, mentioned in family Bibles, whispered about on genealogy forums. For many, she symbolized a connection to something richer than just fame. She offered Elvis a kind of spiritual ancestry, something ancient and American. But when myth starts to unravel, what rushes in to fill the gap? That's when another theory gained momentum, one with even deeper implications. A theory that pointed not to a single woman, but to an entire people erased from the margins of history. an entire community hidden in plain sight. They were called Melungeons. That single word unlocked 1,000 doors. The Melungeons were an isolated, enigmatic group living in the shadowy hollows of Appalachia. Their origins defied explanation. Some believed they descended from Portuguese sailors, others claimed Turkish servants, or freed people of color fleeing persecution. Whatever their past, one thing was certain. They didn't fit America's racial categories. Not white, not black, not native. Something else. And in a society built on dividing lines, that ambiguity became a curse. Melungeon families were pushed to the edges, disregarded, misclassified, forgotten. But they survived, and their survival created a culture as rich as it was misunderstood. They spoke with a lilt that wasn't quite Southern. Their food carried hints of Mediterranean spice, and their traditions, from funerals to folk tales, bore traces of Africa, Europe, and beyond. Then came the connection that turned whispers into full-throated speculation. Elvis himself. People started to notice. The dark hair, the high cheekbones, that olive-toned complexion. Yes, he dyed his hair later, but childhood photos told a different story. He didn't quite look like the blonde, blue-eyed face of 1950s stardom. And his music? It wasn't just rock and roll. It was everything. Blues, gospel, hillbilly ballads, folk, and soul all tangled together. That mix wasn't random. It was inheritance. The sound of a boy raised at the crossroads of cultures. Was it possible that Elvis's genius was rooted in a heritage the world refused to see? The deeper people dug, the more they found breadcrumbs. Early Presley ancestors living in Melungeon-heavy counties. Unexplained changes in race designation in family records. Patterns that matched other Melungeon-descended families. And by the 2000s, researchers began placing Elvis on speculative Melungeon family trees. No smoking gun, but enough to raise eyebrows and hopes. Because this wasn't just about Elvis. It was about reclaiming forgotten people, giving voice to erased stories. But just as this theory seemed ready to reshape the Elvis narrative, 2025 brought the cold edge of science. A full-scale genetic deep dive, the most ambitious ever attempted on a public figure of his stature. DNA doesn't flinch, it doesn't flatter. And what it revealed didn't just clarify the mystery, it redirected the spotlight entirely. The Melungeon thread, for all its compelling romance, wasn't the final answer. The truth had been sitting quietly all along, tucked away not in legend, but in overlooked records and neglected family trees. Elvis Presley was Jewish, not metaphorically, not symbolically, documented, traceable, proven. It all started with a woman named Nancy Burdine Tackett, Elvis's great-great-grandmother, a Jewish immigrant from Lithuania, whose bloodline carried through the maternal side of the Presley family. And in Judaism, that's everything. According to Jewish law, identity is passed down from mother to child. That means Elvis, born to Gladys Presley, was Jewish by birth. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't internet sleuthing. This was fact. But why had it been ignored? Why didn't anyone talk about it when Elvis was alive? The answer may lie in the times he lived in. In the conservative, often prejudiced South of the 1940s and 50s, being Jewish could complicate everything. The entertainment world was no less complex. While many of Hollywood's power players were Jewish, stars were often encouraged to present a generic, all-American image. For a rising Southern boy trying to break into the mainstream, talking about Jewish ancestry might have seemed like a risk not worth taking. Still, hints were there. Elvis was known to wear a Star of David necklace alongside a Christian cross. He kept a Hebrew Bible among his personal effects. Friends claimed he was fascinated by Jewish mysticism, intrigued by the Kabbalah, drawn to the teachings of rabbis. He never said much about it publicly, but in private, the connection was real. When the 2025 investigation finally confirmed his lineage, it wasn't just a footnote, it was a revelation, a missing chapter, finally restored. The king of rock and roll didn't just inherit America's musical soul, he carried within him the spiritual echo of a people with a long, resilient history. The boy from Tupelo was also the descendant of shtetl survivors. The performer who electrified Vegas had ties to the Torah. And suddenly, everything about his blend of spiritual searching, cultural fusion, and musical innovation made more sense. For those who always sensed there was more to Elvis than the legend allowed, this discovery wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. The story of Elvis Presley was never just one of fame, of girls and guitars and glittering jumpsuits. It was the story of America itself, complicated, layered, and full of hidden truths. And now, for the first time, one of those truths had finally come to light. A voice that transcended boundaries, a sound born from contradictions. That was Elvis Presley. He wasn't molded by one tradition, nor did he belong to one world. From his earliest steps on stage, he carried the echoes of Southern gospel, black spirituals, and the raw soul of rhythm and blues. As a young boy in Tupelo and later Memphis, he lingered outside black churches, drawn to the voices inside. That rhythm lived in him. It wasn't borrowed. It was absorbed, like breath. His movements, his tone, his phrasing, it all came from a cultural intersection America still struggles to define. Elvis didn't just reflect his times, he rattled their foundation. But the deeper truth, the one even Elvis may not have fully grasped, was hiding in plain sight. His music, often labeled a white man's take on black sound, was more than homage. It was instinct. For decades, fans and critics debated where Elvis belonged culturally. He was accused of taking, not sharing. But behind the debates was a larger, more haunting question. What if Elvis's connection ran deeper than anyone imagined? The world got its answer in 2025. Nearly 50 years after his death, a breakthrough DNA study cracked open the mystery of Elvis Presley's ancestry. Scientists and genealogists teamed up to trace his genetic roots, peeling away decades of myth. It started with the persistent tale of Cherokee heritage through the enigmatic mourning dove white. But that story, long repeated and accepted, unraveled under scrutiny. DNA samples and historic cross-referencing made it clear. Mourning dove white wasn't real. The romanticized notion of native ancestry vanished. There was no genetic proof. The story had never belonged to him. But the real shock came next. A stunning revelation that reframed his entire life. DNA testing confirmed Elvis's maternal Jewish heritage. His lineage traced back to Nancy Burdine Tackett, a Jewish woman from Lithuania. Under Jewish law, this meant Elvis would be considered Jewish from birth. He never publicly embraced this truth. Perhaps he never fully knew it. Yet it now stands scientifically indisputable. And more astonishing still was the discovery of a distant African maternal ancestor, an unnamed woman likely living in the Deep South during the early 1800s, whose identity had been lost to time, silenced by history, or erased through necessity. This wasn't just an academic revelation. It struck at the core of who Elvis was. The man whose voice carried the soul of a church choir, who moved with the rhythm of the Delta, who sang with raw, unfiltered ache. He had blood that connected him to those very traditions in ways no one expected. What fans once speculated about his complexion or musical feel suddenly had roots. Tiny in percentage, monumental in meaning. He wasn't borrowing culture. He was culture. It's a truth that deepens, not diminishes, his legacy. The man once viewed as a cultural lightning rod now becomes a reflection of the American mosaic, complex, hidden, and painfully real. His career, seen in hindsight, feels prophetic. Elvis bridged divides he didn't always understand. Now, we know why. He was the intersection. His spiritual hunger, too, takes on new weight. Elvis wasn't just seeking fame, he was searching for meaning. He devoured religious texts from every tradition: Christianity, Judaism, mysticism, the metaphysical. He wore the Star of David beside the Christian cross, not for fashion, but as if trying to harmonize the chords of his soul. In private moments, he'd ask those close to him, "Why me?" Not in arrogance, but confusion. The weight of destiny seemed to press on him. Perhaps now we understand what he was trying to name. And behind the spiritual questions and hidden heritage stood a man who lived a life few could imagine. Elvis Presley's financial kingdom was as grand as his legend. He owned a fleet of luxury cars that included multiple Cadillacs, a Rolls-Royce Phantom Phi, a Stutz Blackhawk, and his beloved pink Cadillac. His watch collection featured prized timepieces like the Omega constellation and a diamond-encrusted Hamilton. Graceland, his Memphis estate, was only the beginning. He also acquired properties in California and Las Vegas. Private jets? He had his own customized Convair 880, dubbed the Lisa Marie, outfitted with gold-plated seatbelts and suede chairs. But Elvis was more than a spender. He was an early brand builder. He invested in music publishing, merchandising, and launched his own production company. His assets were heavily insured, covering everything from his voice to his touring schedule. The lesson in Elvis's financial journey is clear. Legacy wealth isn't just about what you earn, it's about how you protect and preserve it. His empire, still generating millions, proves that long-term value comes from brand vision, diversification, and emotional connection. Looking back, Elvis's rise from a poor Mississippi boy to a global icon wasn't just improbable, it was mythic. He became the king of rock and roll in an era when America wasn't ready for what he represented. And now, we know why he felt torn. That ache in his voice, the fire in his performance. It wasn't just performance, it was inheritance. The silence he carried, the mysteries in his family's past, the sense of being set apart. It all makes sense now. Elvis Presley wasn't just shaped by history. He was history. In 2025, science didn't just explain Elvis. It redeemed him. It gave clarity to the confusion, light to the shadows, and voice to a story that had long been whispered but never fully told. For nearly a century, we misunderstood who he truly was. But now, we see the full picture. More complex, more diverse, more human. Elvis Presley was more American than we ever knew, because he carried all its contradictions, all its echoes, and all its truths. What would Elvis have thought if he'd known? Maybe, just maybe, he already did. See you next time. So, Elvis wasn't just the king. He was a mystery, a mirror, and a movement. Smash that like, drop your thoughts below, and subscribe for more untold legends. Long live the legacy.